All right, then,
Thank you.
thank you. This evening, we're very pleased and proud to have Don Laylander as our guest speaker. Don is one of the more prominent and accomplished archaeologists and historians here in Southern California. I will give a very brief background of where he's coming from. He received a bachelor's in history from UCLA and went on to get his master's in anthropology from San Diego State University. He has participated in archaeology throughout most parts of California, including working extensively for the U.S. Forest Service, for Caltrans, and most recently, prior to his retirement, ASM affiliates. The talk this evening is based on a study that he did for the Bureau of Land Management in 2013 to 2015. He has also been a frequent contributor to our own quarterly and has published dozens of articles in various publications that have covered a wide variety of aspects of prehistory of both Alta and Baja California. I also wish to note that he has 2 articles that will be coming out in the next issues of the quarterly, dealing with both history and religious sites here in Southern California. His talk this evening is Old Site Records and a New Perspective on Prehistoric Settlement Stability. Specifically, this is a study in the McCain-Jacumba-Ocotillo region there on the extreme Southern California, right near the Mexican border. He has noted that archaeologists approach the problem of reconstructing the prehistoric past with a variety of strategies and methods. Among these are intensive site excavations, the restudy of curated archaeological collections, archaeological surveys of sizable areas, and the analysis of a region's previously collected site records. Each of these approaches has its own advantage and drawbacks. The talk this evening is going to concentrate on the last of these methods, focusing specifically on a study of an overwhelming number here, 2,319 prehistoric site records that were previously documented in the 420 square mile McCain-Jacumba-Ocotillo area of southeastern San Diego County and southwestern Imperial County. Out of the results on a variety of topics arising from the study, this talk will consider the question of prehistoric stability or change in the locations of habitation sites and what the implication may be concerning prehistoric demography and mobility strategies. And with that, Don, we will turn this meeting over to you to let us know what you found out.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction, and good evening to all. So do I need to do something to be on the screen, or? Share screen.
Right now,
Now,
did you notice?
having a little trouble getting where I need to be. Says you're screen sharing it. I don't see that on my computer, but
Okay, we see it.
Yeah, we see your screen.
We see multiple folders.
And on the far left, about 1/3 of the way down, is a folder that says PCAS Talk 2022.
Okay. Well, I can call up the PowerPoint and go for slideshow.
We've got it on full screen now.
Good, I think we're there now.
Perfect.
Well, I'll be a bit repeating some of the things that Steve just said, but to orient you in this talk, what I'd like to do is share with you some thoughts on two main points. One of those points is about the advantages and the disadvantages or drawbacks of using a particular research tool for reconstructing our regional prehistory. The tool in question is the analysis of large sets of old site records, particularly when they're reanalyzed with a GIS or Geographic Information System. The second point that I want to make is about an example of using such site records. It's about the perspective on a specific research issue that one set of those records provides. The issue is the stability or the mobility of late prehistoric settlements that existed within a part of Southern California. Here we go. But first, that question about research methods. There are four main ways that we archaeologists go about harvesting data in order to tell us things about prehistory. Each of the
Excuse
four
me,
methods.
Don, we've had a request that you speak a little louder.
Okay. Come a little closer, and I'm not sure if I can increase the volume without losing the PowerPoint, however.
No, you are louder already. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, but first, there's that question about research methods. There are four main ways we archaeologists go about harvesting data in order to tell us things about prehistory. Each of the four methods has its advantages, but each of them also has some drawbacks. What's maybe the classic archaeological approach is site excavation on a substantial scale. On the plus side, we can use this to recover large samples of diverse artifacts and ecofacts. We can discover subsurface features through excavation. We can get those artifacts and ecofacts and features from contexts that are interpretable. And with some luck, maybe they'll also be datable. On the downside, though, excavation and the analysis of the materials that are recovered through excavation are pretty labor-intensive businesses, and therefore they're also fairly expensive. In excavating, we're also potentially destroying some of the information that the site contains. That information won't be available in its raw state at some time in the future, when perhaps our methods of extracting information may become more sophisticated than they are at present. Another negative point to consider is that there are interpretive fallacies that can sometimes occur when we focus too much on the information from a single site. This can happen if we treat the site as a normative type site. We may come to think that this one site by itself is fully representative of the prehistoric culture that the site belonged to. We may overlook the likely existence of functional diversity and other kinds of diversity among contemporaneous sites, sites that belong to that same culture, and sites that were maybe even used by the same prehistoric individuals. The second alternative, and this is one that's becoming increasingly popular, is to reanalyze curated materials from previous excavations, as well as from archaeological surface collections, and even from privately made collections. This can reduce both the expense and the impacts that would be associated with our doing new field studies. On the other hand, again, there's the problem of potentially giving too much weight to single sites, and the available materials may well be incomplete, or they may be poorly documented, or maybe they're based on outdated field methods. More than likely, those methods were selected to serve a different set of objectives than the ones that we're most interested in now. A third choice is to conduct a focused new archaeological survey. Well-trained crews can generate closely comparable and relevant data. They can do this by using standardized recording methods and methods that are designed to serve our explicit research objectives. These surveys can also include negative evidence, meaning documenting what's not to be found in the study region, as well as what actually is there. That kind of survey can encompass a diversity of site types and contexts over a fairly large area. One weakness is that in a region like California, most of the prehistoric sites, unfortunately, can't be placed chronologically with very much precision or with much certainty on the basis of survey data alone. And again, this approach is likely to be labor intensive and therefore expensive. Fourth choice is the one that I'm discussing tonight. This one is based on analyzing large sets of previously created archaeological site records. In particular, those records can now be analyzed with computer-based GIS. There are admittedly some serious drawbacks to this method as well. One is that comparability is reduced by the differences in recording standards, as well as in the skills of the folks who are doing the original site records. Maybe even more so than is the case with the curated artifact collections. The recorded site data are likely to reflect different research goals and data needs than the goals and the data needs of the archaeologist who's doing the reanalysis. The field strategies used in site recordation may have been incompletely documented in the available records. That can make it difficult to assess potentially important biases or gaps in the data, as well as to assess apparent negative evidence. And as with focused new surveys, most of the sites recorded in our region are probably going to be difficult to place chronologically. On the other hand, there are also some advantages to this approach. Like focused archaeological surveys, such analyses as these go beyond individual site studies to get at the bigger picture. And by that I mean the picture of prehistoric archaeological landscapes. As with reanalyzing curated collections, the cost and the impacts are more limited than would be true if we were doing new field work. Using the older data may also partly offset our progressive loss through time of information from sites that were recorded in the past, but that either no longer exist or are no longer accessible to us for study. There have been a number of important studies that have analyzed sets of existing site records. One that's just caught my attention very recently was a statewide California study that was published last year about bedrock milling features. That study looked at research issues as well as specifically management-oriented concerns that often motivate such studies. Turning more specifically to Southern California, and even more specifically than that, to the areas of San Diego and Imperial counties, there have been several studies that were based on sets of site records. Some of those studies are listed on the slide. For tonight, I want to focus on one particular study. That was one that I worked on a few years ago in 2013 to 2015, together with Jerry Schaefer, Nick Deuce, and others at ASM affiliates. And that project was done for the BLM, or the US Bureau of Land Management. It involved the creation of a GIS database for the McCain-Jacumba-Ocotillo study area. This has also sometimes been called the Sunrise Corridor. That area consists of 1,074 square kilometers, or 420 square miles, in southeastern San Diego County and southwestern Imperial County. The region in question is immediately north of the US-Mexico border, and it straddles the boundary between the Peninsular Range on the west and the Colorado Desert in the east. For CRM administrative reasons, the study area was divided arbitrarily into two halves of approximately equal areas. The McCain Valley-Jacumba half to the west was defined as the land above the 1,500-foot elevation contour, and the Ocotillo half to the east is below that contour. But tonight, at least in most cases, we'll ignore that division and just treat this as a single study area. Specific, spatially defined information about the natural environment in the study area was taken from existing databases on those subjects, and that information was then fed into our GIS. The kinds of environmental data included the variables that are listed on this slide that you can see. We needed to assess how similar or how dissimilar with respect to those environmental variables the site locations were as compared to locations where no archaeological sites had been recorded. To do this, we created a sample to represent statistically the environment of the study area as a whole. Excuse me. A grid of 11,935 sample points was spaced systematically at 300-meter intervals, plotted throughout the study area. This made it possible for us to compare the frequencies of environmental variables at sites with the frequency of those same variables at what were essentially random points in the region. We used another measure to at least help to limit the problem of archaeological sample bias. That consisted of differentiating the parts of the study region that had been addressed by reports that were listed in the National Archaeological Database, or NADB, differentiating them from portions of the regions that hadn't been addressed in such reports, or non-NADB areas. On the slide, the red dots represent NADB areas and the green dots represent non-NADB areas. This at least partly corrected for the bias that came from the fact that some areas and some sorts of settings had been inventoried archaeologically, while others hadn't been inventoried. Of course, this was just a very imperfect correction. There were a lot of sites that had been recorded within non-NADB areas. And we know that the NADB areas themselves had not necessarily been fully surveyed archaeologically. but at least this helped to limit the bias. In all, 25% of the study region consisted of NADB areas, and the other 75% was in non-NADB areas. Turning now specifically to archaeology, the GIS contained data that were taken from old site records for 2,319 prehistoric sites, as well as for 477 prehistoric isolates. The analysis of the record was based on two types of information or categories: cultural attributes at the sites and a set of site types. For the cultural attributes, we started with the codes that were used by DPR, or the California Department of Parks and Recreation, in its site forms. But then we expanded on the DPR codes by using additional subcategories and by including some quantitative data on most of the attributes. In all, 31 attributes were recorded for the sites. In our reports, we argued that for many purposes, site attributes are a more effective analytical tool than site types. And I'd add that this agrees with the cases that I've at least tried to argue elsewhere for some other aspects of our region's archaeological record. For example, concerning the preferability of attribute analysis over type analysis for discussing prehistoric ceramics and for the analysis of projectile points. Despite that, though, tonight's discussion will mostly be based on site types. Working from their recorded attributes, we reclassified the sites into 12 types. This was based on a typology for the study area that was prepared by Anna Noah. Anna's typology in turn was based on one that Jerry Schaefer and I had developed for the Chuckwalla Valley area in eastern Riverside County. Those 12 types are listed on the slide. Two of them are the main focus for tonight's talk. Those are the two at the top of the table: habitation bases and temporary camps. These two types can be considered together as habitation sites. The next two slides discuss the criteria that were used in defining habitation bases and temporary camps. And I'm not going to read those out to you or even pause long enough here for you to read it and absorb it in terms of what's written. But maybe you can skim over them or perhaps look at them online if you're interested. This first slide is the definition for habitation bases. And this second slide shows how we define temporary camps. I think that the study produced some interesting interpretive results on a number of different issues. That's true for looking at the correlation between environmental variables and archaeological site types and attributes, for instance. That kind of analysis has often been the focus of studies like those ones that were listed on that earlier slide for San Diego and Imperial counties. There isn't time to go into natural environmental correlates tonight. If you're interested in reading more on that subject, you could take a look at an article that's in volume 28 of the Society for California Archaeology's annual proceedings. That's available online. And for much more detail, the full reports of the McCain-Jacumba study and the Ocotillo study are also available in the site of academia.edu. But what I want to focus on now is one specific research issue that concerns the frequency and the spatial distribution of habitation sites and what that information may suggest about the stability or instability of prehistoric settlements in this region through time. Two extreme models of settlement stability or instability might be suggested. On the one hand, the members of a community might have passed something that was close to their entire lives, living at and around a single fixed residential base, using that as their headquarters season in and season out, generation after generation, even century after century. At the opposite extreme, a community might have been fully nomadic, rarely spending more than a night or two consecutively at any one location. From the ethnohistoric, ethnographic, and archaeological evidence that we do have, I think we can safely say that neither of those extreme models applies to the prehistoric communities of Southern California, and not at any rate during the late prehistoric period. The significant issue is just where along the continuum that extends between those two extremes native Southern California communities belonged. Archaeological excavations can give us some clues, but those clues can also be quite misleading. If we find seasonality markers, such as in faunal or floral remains, then we may know that a site was occupied during certain seasons, but we don't know how often that happened or how continuously within those seasons it happened. If we get a good suite of radiocarbon dates that span a long chunk of prehistory, we might be tempted to suppose that the site was in continuous use throughout that long time span. But occupational hiatuses are usually hard for us to see archaeologically. That's particularly true because of the problems we have in much of our region with the local processes of deposit formation and of natural post-depositional disturbance, such as our all too familiar rodent burrowing. The absence of clear evidence of hiatuses doesn't necessarily mean that hiatuses didn't exist, or in fact weren't very common. My own view would be that hiatuses usually were in fact very common. From the McCain-Jacumba-Ocotillo GIS database, I think we can draw some inferences about settlement stability through the use of a few variables. The main one is the density of recorded habitation sites, that is, those habitation bases and temporary camps. Also of interest is the proximity of such sites to each other and the proximity of the habitation sites to non-habitation work sites, sites that were used for procuring or processing resources rather than for their consumption. So what should we excuse me, what should we expect the density of habitation sites to be? We don't know for certain the size of the daily catchment area or foraging radius around a habitation site. By the daily catchment area, I mean the area within which folks were likely to have made daily trips out from and back to the habitation site. It would probably have been somewhat variable. We can take one reasonable approximation from a model that was put forward by the influential archaeologist Louis Binford. Binford suggested a foraging radius of 10 kilometers, or about 6 miles. Dividing the region most efficiently into hexagonal catchment areas with radii that involve distances from the base of no more than 10 kilometers would give individual catchment areas of 260 square kilometers in the idealized model. Let's suppose for a moment that each such catchment was occupied by a habitation site whose location was stable over the long term. In that case, the McCain Valley-Jacumba-Ocotillo area of 1,074 square kilometers would be expected to have had just 4 habitation sites. But according to the GIS archaeological data, there were 49 habitation bases and 389 temporary camps, or a total of 438 recorded habitation sites in the study area. Of course, that's almost certainly incomplete because it's a safe bet that there were additional habitation sites in the study area that just hadn't been documented yet archaeologically. That count is 100 times the number that would be predicted by an extreme model of settlement stability. The corresponding portion of the study area that falls within NADB areas is 260 square kilometers. That's an area that might be predicted on the average to have held only a single habitation site, but the observed numbers are 37 habitation bases and 257 temporary camps, for a total of 294 habitation sites in NADB areas. That's nearly 300 times the predicted frequency. Of course, this NADB figure was almost certainly somewhat exaggerated. That's because the archaeological studies that were reported in NADB presumably included a disproportionate share of locations that were most suitable for habitation sites. These locations would include relatively flat valleys and other well-watered areas, for instance. Another way of considering the proliferation of habitation sites is to consider the average distances between the recorded habitation sites. The table on the slide summarizes the mean distances. Those distances might be just a little bit too high because they don't allow for edge effects. And by edge effects, I mean cases in which the nearest habitation site may have lain just outside of our study boundaries. However, by inspection of the mapped site locations, it doesn't seem at all likely that this bias was large, if it existed at all. At any rate, the observed average spacing between habitation sites is on the order of 0.2 to 0.5 kilometers. In the idealized model of 10-kilometer hexagonal catchments, the corresponding spacing would be 17.3 kilometers. I'll also mention here very briefly the possible implications of the location of other site types relative to habitation sites. 2 of the other site types account for 800 of the sites in the study area. One of these 2 types consists of lithic quarries and or workshops, and a large portion of those are workshops. The other type is made up of biotic resource extraction / processing sites. And those ones are mostly either milling sites or thermal feature sites, including agave roasting pits, which are common in this region. With stable habitation sites, we'd expect most of these work sites to have been located far enough away from the habitation site that it wouldn't have been convenient to take the resources that were being worked directly back to the habitation site to be worked there. Without getting into any statistical analysis, that doesn't appear to be the pattern. Apparently, a considerable portion of these work sites were situated at no great distance from habitation sites. This suggests that the work site and the nearby habitation site, most likely weren't being used at the same time. So the number of habitation sites is clearly a whole lot greater, and their spacing is a whole lot closer than would be predicted by an idealized model of long-term stable settlements or sedentism. What are some possible implications of that for that archaeological observation? One suggestion that might be that long-term change could account for at least some of the changes in locations that were found to be most suitable for use as habitation sites. These changes could include environmental shifts. For instance, springs might have opened up or closed, or streams might have shifted their beds. Or changes in culturally available tools and know-how might have introduced some different standards to be used in choosing locations for habitation sites. The bow and arrow might have changed hunting practices, and that might have affected settlement choices. Or the adoption of plant resources that required elaborate processing, such as perhaps acorns, might have motivated shifts. It's at least possible that ethnic displacements might have caused shifts. Still, such long-term changes don't seem likely to have been a major factor, if they were even a factor at all, in accounting for the proliferation of habitation sites. It's also notable that a large portion of the habitation sites are known to contain pottery, indicating that they were in use during the last 1,000 years or so of prehistory. Another possible explanation might be that the model's figure for the size of site catchments could be much too high. Certainly there could have been smaller catchments, each having its own habitation base, particularly in a region with topography as varied as this. And therefore that would have meant more permanent habitation sites within a study area, study region. But I don't think that factor is plausible as significant on the sort of scale that's in evidence here. It would require hundreds of times as many catchments as the model suggests. Another very important possibility, which is worth taking seriously, is that village settlements were much less nucleated than we've usually thought of them as being. Communities may have been considerably more spread out. Many temporary camps or even some habitations might have been just homesteads that were occupied conceivably on a permanent basis by individual families who nonetheless belonged to one permanent central community. One variant of this idea would be the operation of the seasonal fission-fusion model of settlement, a model that was favored by D.L. True and some other portions of this region in the upland areas on Palomar Mountain and in the Cuyamaca Mountains. It's possible that the studier might have been settings for an annual phase of community fission into scattered settlements. Another possibility to consider is that sites that we've identified as temporary camps and even some of the habitation bases were really just workstations that were being exploited logistically from the true habitation bases. However, the relative diversity of archaeological remains at these sites, which is what led us to classify them as habitation bases and as temporary camps in the first place, argues against this. So does the relatively short distance of many of the temporary camps from habitation bases, as seen on a previous slide. That doesn't suggest that the temporary camps were being used logistically within the catchment. The model that I'd favor is that 4, maybe 5 catchments in this region were used seasonally, but then were largely or perhaps entirely abandoned when the community moved elsewhere, either into an adjacent catchment or farther afield, perhaps to the shoreline of Lake Cahuilla or to the high mountains or to the coast, the Gulf Coast or the Pacific Coast. The catchments may have been reoccupied during another season or in the following year. Given their resources, it doesn't seem likely that the McCain Valley or Jacumba Valley or the eastern edge of the Peninsular Range would have been entirely abandoned for any very long stretch of time, at least during the late prehistoric period. But when their reoccupation did occur, I'd suggest that new habitation locations were very commonly chosen. In many agricultural societies, people have made substantial investments in infrastructure in their villages and in their adjacent croplands as well. In contrast to that, the foragers of this region made only quite small investments in infrastructure. So habitation shifts weren't very costly for them. There are several possible factors that would have favored regularly shifting to new habitation sites. First, if the site were allowed to lie fallow for a while, that would reduce the overexploitation of resources such as plants, animals, and maybe especially firewood in the immediate area around a habitation site. Second, it would have reduced the negative sanitary effects that come from the continued use of a habitation site over a long period. And third, it would accommodate some supernatural taboos that are well documented in this region's ethnography. Among other things, those taboos called for the destruction or avoidance of the houses and other possessions that had belonged to or been associated with recently deceased members of the community. Of course, some habitation site locations would probably have had an optimal value in terms of their environmental settings. For instance, in access to varied resources as to travel corridors. Those locations would likely have been frequently reused, although perhaps following a decent interval of abandonment. But with potential annual shifts occurring over hundreds and thousands of years, it's easy to imagine a very large number of discrete archaeological habitation sites being created in the region. So what are some of the implications of this suggested pattern of shifting settlements for our understanding of regional prehistory? There may be several implications, but here I'd like to highlight one that's demographic. There have been a variety of attempts to estimate the pre-mission population of the Kumeyaay, that is, Dayegueño speakers, including Ipai, Kumeyaay proper, Tipai, Kamiya, and Kuat. The slide lists some of those estimates, and Krober's estimate may have been a little too low, but I think Shipping's was almost certainly too high. One method that's used in making population estimates has been to count the number of villages that are known, for instance, through mission records, through ethnographic records, through archaeological records, or through some combination of those. The village count is then multiplied by an estimate of the average village population size. That method was used particularly in the Luiseno area, which I think many of you will be more familiar with than the one that I'm discussing tonight. However, this method is seriously undermined by the likelihood I've been stressing that not all, quote, village, unquote, sites were ever in use simultaneously. By the way, there's some explicit ethnohistoric testimony to that instability of village locations as well. So the ideas that I've been trying to push for your consideration tonight are basically just two. The first is that statistically analyzing old site records is one practical way at getting new archaeological information about prehistoric landscapes. Certainly, it's not a method that should be used to the exclusion of the other three, but it's one that seems well worth considering, and perhaps it should be used more frequently than it has been. The second idea is that among its other values, particularly in identifying environmental correlates of sites, this method can also shed some light on social aspects of settlement systems. Those aspects might not be so apparent if we were using only ethnographic, ethnohistoric, or other kinds of archaeological strategies by themselves. At any rate, those are the ideas that are put out here tonight for your consideration. Thanks to the other folks who worked on this study. Thanks to PCAS for this opportunity to discuss these with you. And thanks to you, both those of you in Irvine and on Zoom, for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them if I can.
Well, Don, thank you very much for that. It covered a lot of ground, yeah, intellectually and physically. I can hardly imagine reviewing over 2,000 site records like that. I would think you had a crew of people helping you with preparing this material.
I will say that in the analyses of the site records themselves, the direct analyses, Jessica Hennessy was working for ASM under the supervision of Jerry Schaefer to do the majority of that work, which was a lot of coding. So she certainly deserves credit for that.
I do have an initial question myself, and the map that you showed early on, showing where areas had been surveyed, and therefore a lot of information would have been taken from work done in those areas. When I was working for SWCA in the 2000s, around 2004, I think it was, we were involved with a potential power line survey that extended from the Mount Signal area, in initial, edge of BLM land, all the way across, from south of the 8 freeway, across north of it to just north of Ocotillo, and then across into McCain Valley, up through McCain Valley to the north and around, And then as far as the edge of the next reservation, Alpine Reservation. And I just didn't happen to see that line on your map. So, we came across a lot of sites. We had 3 crews out there all surveying the entire length. I guess it's possible those records weren't available yet when you were doing your work.
It's it's at least possible that it hadn't been recorded, logged into NADB, or the National Archaeological Database. I'm not sure offhand, but we were basing the map to which you refer strictly on the reports that had been logged into NADB at that time.
I know we came across almost an even number of sites that had been recorded, and we updated the forms and new sites that we came across. Often following we get into an area and we'd be following the edge of one of the Kumeyaay reservations or another. We didn't go on or across reservations, and so we did a lot of boundary edge surveys. But quite a diversity of terrain, like you talk about, and it was my introduction to McCain Valley. I'd never been there before, and I'm really glad I got a chance to walk the length of it. Please, everyone else, if you have questions, feel free to bring them up.
Just to make sure there's no confusion, the work that you've done, or to which you refer, may not have been logged on NADB. The report may not have, and therefore it would not show up on that one map. But the sites that were recorded were certainly included.
Okay.
The site information didn't come off of the site reports themselves, but through the state clearinghouse at San Diego State.
Well, then in the meantime, while people are formulating their questions, I hope, I do have another comment or question about the definition of a habitation site. The idea of a permanent habitation site, as maybe something that's equivalent to a village. It has a certain number of characteristics. And I was just wondering if some smaller sites that might have had a diversity of activities taking place, but inhabited by a smaller number of people or for a shorter period of time, may have met the definition of a habitation site, whereas others that were larger and maybe even a greater number of site characteristics might have more fit the definition of a village, but these got lumped together under habitation versus temporary camp.
Yes, I think the typology is very iffy, but it's one approximation at least to use. As I kind of alluded to the fact that I'm not a great believer in typologies that aren't rigorously defined. And I will say, I intentionally avoided using the term village for habitation bases, because I think there's a potentially misleading characteristic of the term village. A village can be either a geographical location, or it can be the community that occupied that location. And for when you're dealing with sedentary groups, that difference doesn't really matter much. But if you're dealing with fairly mobile things and you talk about villages, it's important to distinguish the village or the habitation base from the village or the community that may have occupied that habitation base for part of its time and may have occupied other habitation bases or temporary camps at other times.
Excuse me. So did these folks live in groups of 5s or 10s or 20s or 50 people?
For that, we would have to call upon the ethnographic record and maybe to a certain extent the ethnohistoric record. I don't think we can get at a very good estimate of the size of communities. I think the community that occupied a habitation base would be expected to be larger than what you're talking about, though. That would be a number of different families. And some might say 50 individuals. Some might even say 100 individuals, although perhaps communities may have been larger farther to the west in better watered areas than the ones we're talking about. But realistically, we don't have good evidence as to how large these prehistoric settlements were, how populous they were.
Thank you. Continuing on a little, does anyone have any idea of family size? Would they have 3 children, 4 children, 2 children? Is there any kind of idea of that?
The only way we could get it at that, I think at this point, would be to look at the mission records, and those could be very misleading if we tried to apply the family size records there to the prehistoric communities. And I haven't made a particular study of the mission records, but certainly some of those would record the births of members of the families. But whether those families were larger or smaller under mission circumstances as compared to the pre-mission conditions is perhaps anybody's guess.
This is Steve O'Neill again. I've done work with the mission records up here, about 60 miles north of that area with the Luiseno and Hachimam-Waneno people. So it is a different environment. It is a different cultural group, but certainly some of the coastal and peninsular range areas are very similar. I did look at the traditional families, families who were baptized, who were born and raised in the villages, prior to the mission, and they were baptizing people who were not born at the mission. Generally, I saw families with very commonly ranging from 2 to 5 children in a family. And this might also include people who, children that were born after one or the other parent died and the remaining adult remarried and continued having children with their next spouse. Not necessarily everyone survived to have families and children themselves, however, so this shouldn't be regarded as a growing population, but a very stable population that I observed up in this Orange County, northern San Diego region.
Thank you.
Also, I just might mention, it was not uncommon to find people living into their 50s, 60s from the traditional population. Of course, that age fell dramatically once you started having people born and raised and living in the mission environment. But traditionally, it was not uncommon to see people into their 50s and 60s.
There. Steve, excuse me, I just wanted to thank Don for the lecture tonight, and we're going to sign off. Thank you, Don.
Thank you for the opportunity to present this.
If there are no further questions, then we will conclude the meeting for this month of September. Meantime, I encourage everyone to come back in a month. Where in October, we will have Professor Gabriel Sanchez as our speaker. He is an indigenous anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oregon. He is a director of the Coastal Archaeology and Ancient Proteomics. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that term. Proteomics laboratories. He's currently involved with a collaborative and community-based participatory research project with the Amamutsan tribal band, the Esalen tribe of Monterey County, and California state parks to investigate the native range of California's endangered salmon species. The research defines which salmon were native to coastal streams to currently help tribes and resource managers prioritize stream protection and restoration, water allocation, and inform land use practices. I think this will be particularly interesting to see how research with anthropologists working with indigenous groups here in California, bringing past knowledge and current research to help with tribal practices today. So I hope that you will join us to listen to Dr. Sanchez and come back to us in a month from now. Thank you very much for attending.